And I said to him, in the end, if I'm pushed to it, God can do it any way he liked. So that if it happens to be that way, that is not an argument against the existence of God, any more than the existence of an automatic self-winding watch, which uses random motions of your arm to wind itself up, is an argument against the existence of an intelligent watchmaker.
Professor John Lennox, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Are science and religion in conflict?
I don't really think so. And I've had that impression actually for a very long time, in the sense that when I was at school, I started reading C.S. Lewis. My father gave me some of his books. And it was very interesting reading those books because his take on the history of science, which was based on Alfred North Whitehead actually, was, to quote more or less, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. That fascinated me. And a little bit more research showed me that if you take modern science, I'm not talking about medieval science, modern science, and you start with people like Galileo, and then you move on to Kepler, Newton, and so on. These people were all believers in God with slight variations on it. And it seemed to me there was a pretty close connection between their theism and their approach to science. And in general, historians of science, and when I came to Oxford after a while, I worked for a time with John Hedley-Brooke, who was the first professor of science and religion here, and a wonderful historian.
Yeah.
And he was very cautious, but he said there certainly does seem to be a connection between the biblical worldview and the rise of modern science. So sometimes I say to people who ask me that question that I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist, if you count mathematicians as scientists, and a Christian, because arguably it was the Judeo-Christian worldview that gave me my subject. So I think there's a deep resonance there. And I do think there is a conflict, though, just to explain a little bit further, but it's not between science and faith in God. And I often illustrate this by thinking of the Nobel Prize in Physics. Because, take for example, Peter Higgs, who won it, Scotsman, atheist, brilliant physicist. And then there's another person I know, Bill Phillips, an American Nobel Prize winner for physics and a Christian. And what that tells me, Alex, really is this, that their difference isn't in the realm of physics at all, or science, it's in worldview. And I see a real conflict between the theistic worldview and the atheistic worldview, and there are scientists on both sides. And so I feel that if we take that on board, we can make a more sensible exploration of this whole, well, I think it's a myth, and a lot of historians do as well, that science and religion are necessarily in conflict. I think as a final codicil, I would say it depends what religion you're talking about. I'm talking about the Judeo-Christian worldview, because science conflicts with a lot of religions.
I think this question of the history of science,
yes,
and it being tied up with the Christian worldview is an interesting one, because to me it's slightly different to asking whether the findings of science after the scientific method gets off the ground conflict with the sort of tenets of religious belief. And so I think what a lot of people will think is, okay, the founders of the scientific method were Christian, but of course they were, because everyone was Christian. And if science does somehow undermine Christianity, then of course they would be Christians, because they hadn't invented the scientific method yet to undermine it. And so people will point to the findings of science and say that the explanatory power that these Christian men who wanted to understand the universe found in the scientific method removes the space needed for the explanatory power of God. Now, I know you disagree with that too, of course, but I was hoping you could tell us why.
Well, I think it is an argument that's pretty fair if you apply it to a limited proportion of the Earth.
Yep.
But the interesting thing to me about that, and I've thought about it a fair bit because it's the obvious point to make, and it's a good point to make, is that modern science did not develop among the Chinese. And a lot of study was done on that particular topic by a very famous sinologist who actually, did he found the Academy of Sciences in China? I'm wrestling for his name. You probably know it.
I'm not sure I do.
But he did a lot of research, and he was principally a Marxist in his viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
And that is what makes his conclusion very interesting. He certainly was the author of a massive dictionary of scientific science and all that. He tried to explain within a Marxist framework why modern science of the type you described didn't arise in China. And the conclusion he came to was it was a difference in a fundamental presupposition of the idea that there was a unification in the sense that there was one creator who had created the universe and created the human mind to study it. And the Chinese didn't have that. That was his view. So it seems to me that that is an interesting response to this. If you take the whole world, modern science arose in a particular place, in a particular time, where, in a sense, the general background was Christian. But on the other hand, it didn't arise where the general background was very different. So I think that's how I would respond to it.
John Lennox argues that science and belief in God go hand in hand, pointing to early scientists like Galileo and Newton, who believed in a lawgiver. But that connection doesn't actually prove God exists. It just shows what people believed at the time. In the 1600s, Europe was deeply shaped by Christianity. If you were a scientist back then, you were almost certainly religious. That's culture, not evidence. Today, science works the same way whether someone believes in God or not. You've got atheists like Peter Higgs and believers like William Phillips both winning Nobel Prizes. The results don't change based on belief. Science is built on testing ideas, observation, and repeatable results. It explains things like gravity, disease, and the origin of the universe without needing a supernatural explanation. For example, evolution by natural selection and the Big Bang Theory both came from evidence, not theology.
So two questions come to mind for me. One is the question of the so-called golden age of the Islamic world, with particular reference to mathematics, which will make people think, okay, science arises in the Christian West, but we also have this rich tradition of science and discovery within Islam as well. And the extent to which you said it depends which religion you're talking about, I wondered if you had a view on whether Islam can be similarly credited with scientific knowledge.
I'm not an expert at Islam, but I used to be very interested in what went on in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, where a lot of work was done, and some of it by Christians, by the way, working away at translating some of the more ancient classical documents into languages that were available to people around. And at the very least, in the Islamic tradition, you have a very strong transmission of more ancient texts that, of course, helped with the advance of modern science. But as far as I know, not a great deal of innovation. But I'd put, again, I would say my field is algebra, and the word algebra comes from al-jabr, which is an Arabic word. And in the Islamic world, you had tremendous understanding of observational astronomy and their ways of solving equations and so on, and back into the Babylonian world. So we had certainly a great deal of stuff that was transmitted forward and helped, I would say helped enormously. But in the sort of innovation and experimentation and all this kind of thing, and the vast steps forward taken by people like Galileo, Kepler, Newton, they didn't get that far, but we must credit them.
The other question that came to mind then is one concerning the difference between, say, belief in God as motivating your scientific enterprise and Christianity as a world religion. Because when I think about someone like Galileo, an important founder of the scientific method, and I think about the way that he's treated by the reigning Catholic authorities for presenting an alternate view of the world, although not proving it, arguably, at the time, running into a bit of trouble and ending up finishing his life in house arrest in Tuscany.
Rather luxurious house arrest.
Yeah, he got it quite well. I think this idea that he was tortured for his beliefs is a mistaken one, although allegedly some people believe that he was shown the instruments of torture, as if to say,
that could be.
Keep quiet.
Here again, I think that using Galileo as an example doesn't work, because if you look at what actually happened, the first people to criticize Galileo was not the Catholic Church. It was the philosophers who were building on Aristotle and believed in a fixed earth. And the church got involved rather foolishly because it had climbed on the Aristotelian bandwagon.
Yes.
So you could argue that this is not really science versus Christianity, because Galileo was a Christian. He believed in God before he started all this and when he finished. So I think I would agree with the historians of science that say that the Galileo incident is not really one to be used to show that there's a huge conflict between science and religion.
Yes.
I think the book Galileo's Daughter is well worth reading on this story. And Galileo was a bit silly, and unwise in what he did. He insisted, first of all, on writing in Italian, and that irritated the experts who thought everything should be done in Latin. And secondly, he wrote a text and put the views of the then Pope, who had been his friend, into the mouth of a character he named Simplicio, the fool. And as for PR, I think he comes fairly near a zero.
Yeah,
actually.
And he'd been told by the Catholic Church not to write about heliocentrism, but there was some dispute over what he was allowed to do. And so he writes this philosophical dialogue where he's like, well, I'm not writing an essay in favor of heliocentrism. Correct. I'm writing a dialogue. It's just that the character that disagrees with me is called the fool. And that's what finally did it seems, for the church. For me, I think you're right to say that this isn't a good indication of the conflict between science and religious belief. For me, at best, with the most sort of uncharitable view of the Catholic practice here, it might show a conflict between, say, the scientific method of Galileo and the Catholic Church. But I want to very carefully tease apart the historical question of like world religions and their potential suppression of the scientific method with the more specific point I think you're making, which is about the personal belief in an ordered universe as being necessary to engage in science.
I think that's fair enough. And if you look at various times in church history, I would say that to their shame, and as in the Galileo case, it was only in my lifetime that the Catholic Church rehabilitated Galileo.
Yes.
And that's pretty shameful.
Finally said that he was correct.
Yes. And the same is true, I suppose, of the so-called conflict between Huxley and Wilberforce, after Darwin.
Yes.
That's represented as
this is a debate that happens just down the road at the Natural History Museum
here in the Natural History
in Oxford,
Museum.
And it's between Thomas Huxley, who is a sort of protege of Charles Darwin.
Yes.
And so the newly discovered idea of natural selection is being defended by Huxley, and then you've got the Bishop Wilberforce who is arguing against it. And this is again seen as archetypal science, evolution, undeniable fact, versus
that's right.
the priest that
But it's very
can't accept
interesting.
it.
I've read the whole debate, and I find that many people haven't. And Wilberforce was the kind of cleric who was an amateur scientist. And he seemed to have a lot of leisure for doing that, which might tell us something about the church in those days.
Right.
And Huxley was dead against this. He wanted a professional class of scientists. That's the first. There was a strong bias against it. But when it came to the argument, I was fascinated to discover that very early on in his speech, Wilberforce said, "I am not going to use religious arguments. I am only going to discuss the science." That's often left completely out of the discussion. And again, it was, what was his name? The professor of the history of science at the Open University said that this event should not be used to drive a wedge between science and Christianity. It was a much more complex thing. It was a sociological thing as well. The push to have professional scientists get rid of the clerics, turn the churches into temples to Sophia, the goddess of wisdom, and all this kind of stuff. There was much more going on than simply dealing with science. But poor old Wilberforce, I think he gets the rough end of the stick, and it's not always very accurate.
I mean,
evolution is one of the most tested frameworks in science. We have fossil transitions like Tiktaalik showing fish-to-land evolution, and genetic evidence showing humans share about 98 to 99% of DNA with chimpanzees. That's measurable, repeatable evidence, not speculation. The DNA is too complex argument also falls apart under basic probability and chemistry. Complexity doesn't appear all at once. Simple molecules like RNA can self-replicate under lab conditions, and natural selection works even at that level. This has been demonstrated in experiments like RNA world studies and molecular evolution research. And the chicken and egg problem about DNA and cells, that's a false dilemma. Early life likely didn't start with modern DNA at all. RNA can both store information and catalyze reactions, which is why many scientists see it as a stepping stone to life. Even the Bible contradicts scientific reality. Genesis describes plants existing before the sun, which breaks basic biology. Plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. That's not a small detail, that's a fundamental error.
Instinctively, I think of people who are motivated by their religious beliefs,
Yes.
but so as to convince the non-religious,
Yes.
will abandon that as a strategy of argumentation and say, well, look, I'm not going to rely on my religious views here to convince you.
Yeah.
And yet that is still their motivation to presenting these arguments. And I really don't know when I say, like,
Well,
I don't know what you suspect Wilberforce's motivation was, or if there's anything else that indicates that he really
you're
was
right.
just a science
I take from
enthusiast.
what you're saying that it's always difficult to second guess motivation
Yes.
and to understand what it is. And we can only see that what I find actually interesting is that Wilberforce, it actually occurred to him to say what kind of argument he was using. I thought that was pretty insightful of Wilberforce, in spite of the fact that generations afterwards, nobody took any notice of it. He was actually passionate about the science and felt a case could be rested on the science alone. That's an attitude I like.
Do you think some of these archetypal scientific revolutions, the Copernican revolution, the revolution of biology with natural selection and Charles Darwin, even things like the revolutions in physics with quantum mechanics, do you think that any of these pose any challenges to, say, the Christian worldview? Is there anything about the Christian worldview that you think is at least challenged by these scientific developments?
Well, we need to take them separately.
Sure.
And certainly, as one person has said, at least one, that Darwinism proved to be an engine of atheism.
Yes. Well, I think this is the most important example here is
And
probably evolution.
It is.
Yeah.
Quantum mechanics actually, to take your other example, for some people, opened up the possibility of freedom and all the business of giving, to put it this way, which I don't really like, space for God, so to speak.
Yeah.
And not confining the universe to be a deterministic entity. I think that it is a very interesting case in point that a lot of people jumped to the Darwinist bandwagon, and until relatively recently, it was often used as a reason to get rid of God in some way or other. My thinking of it is, well, it's quite complicated actually. First of all, the idea that there is a creator God is not going to be refuted by a biological theorem. I'm not even convinced they're in the same kind of category.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, evolution, whatever it does, and I'm saying that quite deliberately, whatever it does is not an argument against the involvement of a creator. I spoke to one very leading, well-known biologist who is a strong believer in evolution and is a Christian. And I said to him, in the end, if I'm pushed to it, God can do it any way he liked. So that if it happens to be that way, that is not an argument against the existence of God, any more than the existence of an automatic self-winding watch, which uses random motions of your arm to wind itself up, is an argument against the existence of an intelligent watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
That calling in of randomness doesn't get rid of God at all. But of course, if you're going to use evolution as an argument against God, first of all, you've got to know that evolution is true and you've got to define what it does.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. And here you run into very many more difficulties now than you would have done 20 years ago.
Right.
And I just make 2 points, and they're quite important points. And that is, we need to distinguish between evolution and the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Richard Dawkins, as you know, who's a brilliant writer, I must say, I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And what arrested me in reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, so that's a compliment to Richard, that evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life.
He said that?
Yes, it's in the book.
Yeah.
And it took a very long time for him to realize that the first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
For a very simple reason. Because evolution, again, whatever it does or doesn't do, depends on the existence of life to do anything. So it cannot be the explanation for life. Now, of course, people these days get round that by talking about chemical evolution and so on. That's nothing to do with mutation and natural selection, and we could go into that. But as a mathematician, it's the former interests me more. That is the origin of life itself, because it's almost equivalent, though not quite, to the origin of information. I see there a huge problem. But staying with, now, the second part of Dawkins' assertion it explains all the development of life. Now, here's where I think one has to be nuanced and to be fair, because Darwin was brilliant. He observed things that people had not observed. He observed changes. For example, the famous study of the finch beaks in the Galapagos Islands, and I have a 1,000-page book at home, a famous book on that, and I've read most of it. And that was hailed as evidence, but of what? It certainly was evidence of cyclic change. What not so many people were aware of is that once the drought conditions disappeared, the proportion of long beaks to short beaks actually moved back to what it was before. But nevertheless, he could see that something was happening that filled niches and enabled existing creatures to adapt to new niches. Now, that seems to me to be uncontroversial because we can observe it. But when it goes beyond that to the creation, if I might use that word, of new life forms or all this kind of thing, I think that's a very different matter. Now, I'm very aware that I'm not a biologist. And secondly, I believe in Richard Feynman's wonderful dictum. He says the scientist outside his own field is as dumb as anybody else. And I've got to remember that. But I have tried to read my biology, especially in recent years. And I comfort myself that everybody from Darwin to Dawkins wrote for the intelligent public. They expect us to understand what they write. And I have a huge difficulty with that kind of what we may call macroevolution. But much more interestingly is what has happened in the last few years with so-called systems biology, where the Darwinian mechanism, well, natural selection was his, mutation was later. But if we put both together and we have the neo-Darwinian hypothesis, that has been called into very deep question as being totally inadequate. Here in Oxford, Dennis Noble, one of the most fascinating characters, fellow of the Royal Society, and he's debated Richard on a number of occasions. And his argument is really in the end that natural selection, that neo-Darwinian thesis, doesn't need to be modified, it needs to be replaced because it's completely inadequate. Because now, and here I'm just saying what I read, the problem is, and it's a chicken the egg problem, that most simply perhaps can be realized. Here is DNA. You can't get DNA without a cell. You can't get a living cell without DNA. So how does that work? And what seems to me to be happening, and I've actually written quite a lot about this in a recent book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix, that there appears to be a top-down causation, and it leads to a huge problem because it was enough level of complexity to discover that the DNA molecule was not simply complex, it was linguistically complex. That is, it gave us a 3.4 billion letter long word in a chemical alphabet. And all those letters had to be in the right order. That is a stupendous level of complexity, which has no chance of being generated by random processes. And Richard Dawkins agrees with that. He brings in something that natural selection actually has a different kind of operation, but we're not going to that at the moment. But the point is now, with the more recent discoveries of the nature of the living cell and all the chemical factories in it, there are levels upon levels of complexity beyond the genome. And that just beggars into unbelief,
Mm.
the possibility that any known mechanism can produce that without the input of intelligence.
Mhm.
Evolution is one of the most tested frameworks in science. We have fossil transitions like Tiktaalik showing fish-to-land evolution and genetic evidence showing humans share about 98 to 99% of DNA with chimpanzees. That's measurable, repeatable evidence, not speculation. The DNA is too complex argument also falls apart under basic probability and chemistry. Complexity doesn't appear all at once. Simple molecules like RNA can self-replicate under lab conditions, and natural selection works even at that level. This has been demonstrated in experiments like RNA world studies and molecular evolution research. And the chicken and egg problem about DNA and cells, that's a false dilemma. Early life likely didn't start with modern DNA at all. RNA can both store information and catalyze reactions, which is why many scientists see it as a stepping stone to life. Even the Bible contradicts scientific reality. Genesis describes plants existing before the sun, which breaks basic biology. Plants need sunlight for photosynthesis. That's not a small detail, that's a fundamental error. So after looking at all this, history, science, and the actual evidence, what do you think? Do you believe science points to a creator, or does it stand on its own without needing one? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd really like to hear where you land on this. And if you found this breakdown helpful, make sure to like and subscribe for more. This is just part one of the conversation, so if you want to go deeper into the debate, stick around and watch the next part.